Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone, and today our special guest is a man who has literally busted age-old stereotypes about masculinity and athletics wide open. He's the first openly gay Major League professional rugby player. He played for the New England Free Jacks and in the UK for the Scarborough Rugby Union Football Club, and he won a gold medal while representing Team USA at the 2017 World Maccabiah Games. He also won the 2018 National Championship with the Mystic River Rugby Club. In December 2020, he shocked the world when he revealed on Instagram that he is gay. Since then, he's been dedicated to LGBTQ plus advocacy in sport to inspire inclusivity and acceptance in the world of athletics. I'm thrilled to welcome Devin Ibañez to our show. Devin, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Harvey.
Devin, I've had the honor of interviewing Greg Louganis and Brian Orser on our show, both of whom were world famous athletes who went through a similar experience to yours. But I have to say that rugby is in a whole different league than diving and figure skating. It's an aggressive, macho contact sport that carries a certain image of what it takes to be a player, doesn't it?
Yeah, there really is this kind of age-old idea that, rugby players have to be extremely masculine and very tough. And a lot of the time we're told that those are things that, as an openly gay person, you cannot be, or you're perceived as having to be more feminine or having to be less powerful.
And you've played rugby since you were 15, correct?
Yeah, so I picked it up in high school after I failed to play another sport, which was baseball. I was one of the few players who didn't make the team, and I wasn't playing any sports, and I'd always just really loved to compete, and I just didn't really have an outlet for all this energy that I had, and rugby just sort of popped into my life, and I'd never looked back. I've loved it ever since.
I understand that you told your parents you were gay at the age of 12.
So I've actually been corrected by my own mother on this. I'd been saying that it was when I was 12, and she said, "No, Devin, you were actually 11." So it turns out I was a year younger than I thought I was. But yeah, I came out to my parents very early.
And how did they react?
They were incredible. I mean, I never had any reservations about coming out to my family because some of my youngest memories were, when I was 4 years old, my mom would take me aside and say, just so you know, no matter who you love, we will always love you. We just want you to be happy and then we'll be happy. And I never really knew what those words meant at the time. But then you get to that age where you're starting to, grapple with those feelings and being different from other people. And I always knew that that was something that was just never going to be an issue with my family. I knew that I could tell them and that they'd be there and support me and love me. So that was always a huge weight off my shoulders.
That's really amazing to hear. I had a very different experience when I came out to my parents at the age of 19, and it just warms my heart so much to know that your parents were so open and accepting and loving.
Mm. Yeah, and it is really hard because I hear so many other people's stories and how, difficult it was for them not having that support. And I know how hard it was for me to, come out. Like I mentioned to you, I came out to my parents when I was 11. I didn't come out publicly within rugby until I was 27 years old. So even with this support from my family, I still really struggled to kind of take that final step and be open with everybody because all the messaging you get within our sport and within, the rest of society is, you shouldn't be gay. And being gay is something that is almost, looked down on. It's not something that is seen as a positive or even just, another normal thing that somebody goes through or another characteristic that you have. So it was something that I always really struggled to reconcile with. So I always have so much more respect even for people who are able to take those steps without the support of their family. You know, even for me, it was something that really was a struggle.
So you've loved rugby all your life and you decided to pursue a professional career in rugby, but you kept your sexual identity separate from your rugby career. Did anybody on the team know that you were gay?
I There were a few people who I told when I was playing professionally, and I think it was one of those situations where I thought less people knew than actually did knew because people tend to talk, and I think that some people who said they were going to be a little more tight-lipped about it weren't as respectful of those wishes. But when I was on the team, I really just had the assumption that almost nobody knew. I'd only personally told, I think, two or three people on the team. So it was very much just something that I was kind of going through on my own. And even, in the past, having brought my partner Fergus to rugby matches, I would just bring him there under the assumption that, if anybody asked him who he was, we would just say, oh, he's my friend that I met while I was playing in England. So it was something that I really went through such great lengths to keep secret because I just didn't feel comfortable sharing it with my teammates.
Now, in March 2017, you suffered a life-threatening injury during a rugby match in the UK when you took a shoulder to your Adam's apple. That started you on a personal journey that led you to come out publicly in December 2020. Can you tell us about that journey?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I took a shoulder to the throat in that match, and that was after I'd just been playing overseas for the past 2 years. I'd played in New Zealand, followed by England, and during that time, that was my first sort of experience being out on my own, completely taking care of myself. This is, you're not in college where you have dorms and you have, meal plans. This is just you and your own feelings and your own experiences. And after getting that injury, it really was a wake-up call to me at an age of 23 that this wasn't something that was going to last forever, right? Not just rugby, but life was something that was, as we all know, is something that can kind of be taken at any moment. And when I had that injury where they told me, that I was so close to, losing any sort of access to my airway, I think it was less than a dime of width in my airway when they did the scans of my throat. That was when I really sat down and realized, rugby is something that's really important to me, but it's not the only thing that's important to me, right? And that I have this part of myself that I've never felt connecting or felt comfortable connecting to my rugby career. And that's when I realized that, being an openly gay athlete would be something that would be incredibly meaningful to me and something that I would be proud of and something I could look back on when I look at my playing career and be proud of, beyond just the rugby achievements.
You came out publicly to surprise your boyfriend Fergus, correct?
That was definitely one of the main motivations was to surprise him, but it was also really a lot for myself because it was something that I'd really, even before I met Fergus, because I did fracture my throat in 2017, which is the same year I met Fergus, but it was, March of 2017 versus I met Fergus in December of 2017. So that was sort of a seed that had been planted in my mind. And when I met Fergus, it just kind of added urgency to that, right? It's one thing when you're on your own journey by yourself and you're telling yourself, oh, I'm going to come out this year, or I'm going to come out after I win this championship, or I'm going to come out if I achieve this goal. It's a whole other thing when you're now taking somebody else along that journey, right? And it just got to the point where for my own happiness and for his happiness, I really wanted to just come out and say, that this is somebody who made everything I've been doing these last few years possible, and really kind of write it as almost like an open love letter to my partner, just to say, thank you for being there with me in the nights where, I really thought that I was a failure and I'd convinced myself that, I was not going to live up to this goal I had for myself to, live authentically in my sport while also being a successful athlete.
Well, I love the fact that you've said publicly that part of the reason you came out was to save Fergus from having to be pulled into the closet because of you.
Yeah, and it was something that I was really conscious of, when we were together. And it was actually a really hard conversation we had to have before the 2018 national championships. We had run into my captain randomly in P-Town. We were just there for a day trip. And, I introduced Fergus. I didn't want to do the whole, push him into an alleyway thing and ignore him and talk to my captain. So I introduced them. It was kind of a short, awkward conversation. And after that, Fergus, even though I had taken the time to introduce him, it still was kind of a reminder to him that it was still this awkward thing, right? That we weren't out to everybody, that we couldn't share this with everybody. And we really had to sit down and have a difficult conversation of, are you ashamed of me and our relationship? Or is this something that you're really still just struggling to take that step, and what are you afraid of? And I think that that's when we really had to sit down and, it made it very clear to me that my actions were really harming our relationship and also, harming him. I'm asking him to, keep his Instagram private. I'm asking him not to share photos of us on his Facebook. And when you hear that, of course, your first thought is going to be, well, my partner is ashamed of me, right? He doesn't want people to know that we're together. So going on after that conversation and winning the national championship, I really sat down after that and realized I'm like, I've achieved more than I'd ever set out to achieve in this sport. at this point, for me to say that I need to keep this secret so I can keep achieving more, like this, playing professionally was never the ultimate goal. Winning the national championship was never the ultimate goal. I just wanted to be a great rugby player and enjoy my time. So Fergus really was just that motivator for me to always keep pushing and to keep reminding myself that this was a goal that I had, that I really, wanted to achieve, because like you said, I didn't want to keep, dragging him into the closet with me and forcing him to, keep this part of his life private, because he was proud of it and I was proud of it as well. I just wasn't at the point where I felt like I could share that publicly.
I understand that despite all of that success you were having in rugby, you were suffering from depression prior to coming out.
Yeah, I've kind of had a long history of struggling with depression, kind of even going all the way back towards that age of around, 12 and 13 years old, where I was out to my family and felt very, accepted by them. But then you're in the sports environment, which is a completely different world, right? And you're told that, like I said, that being gay is lesser, and, being gay is often the punchline of the joke, right? And it's something that you're told you don't want to be. You don't want to be that person who's known for being that. And it was just something that I couldn't I couldn't quite get over that hump in my mind. And I think that also being with Fergus, as more time went on, I was wondering, what is wrong with you where you're not willing to come forward and, just own this, because you're not ashamed of it. Your family is not ashamed of it. They all love you. They all support you. What is stopping you? And I always had a reason, right? It was because, oh, I need to sign a professional contract first, or, I need to make sure that I'm, in the best position possible to come out, because I want to be the best, kind of representative for the community as I can be. And you keep finding all these reasons to push it back. And before I came out, I was in a really dark place, because I, played that first professional season. And following that season, I had an injury where they couldn't find out what was wrong. I was dealing with basically pain in my abdominal, and they thought it was a hernia. And it went on to be something completely different. And I ended up being sidelined for, 6, 7 months doing physical therapy and doctors and trying to come back. And during that time, I convinced myself that I had completely failed, right? I'd gone into a professional season and hadn't seized that opportunity to just come out and be myself when I really wanted to. And looking back and seeing, that I was now sidelined with this injury and separated from the sport that I loved. And now there's a pandemic. So even when I come back from my injury, there's no way for me to, get back into that kind of professional setup. I had really convinced myself that I'd failed at something that was really meaningful to me. And that was something that was really hard for me to reconcile.
So what was the reaction of your teammates when you came out?
They were incredible. I mean, my teammates have been nothing but, very supportive since I came out. I've had a lot of them reach out to me and say that, they've always felt like rugby was a very inclusive sport, but it wasn't until, seeing me come out and hearing me talk about my experiences in rugby that they've realized, maybe it's not as inclusive as we think it is, if this is the only gay teammate that I can point to who's felt comfortable to step forward and say, yes, I'm openly gay and I'm proud of that. So I think it's been a very eye-opening experience. And I've also been really surprised to see who some of the supportive people have been. Coaches who have historically been not great about, using homophobic slurs or about making homophobic jokes, are all of a sudden very supportive. And I'm like, was this always the environment? Was this like what I should have expected? And if so, why can't we reciprocate that, in the language we use and the training environments that we're creating? Because right now I know that I'm not the only person who experiences this when they try to play rugby and come out.
Was the public reaction to your coming out what you expected it to be?
I don't think I had any expectation of a like a public reaction. I think that, most of my career, and I think that a lot of people who have been closeted athletes can really relate to this. You just kind of spend your life trying to bleed into the backdrop, right? You don't want to draw too much attention to yourself. You just want to go about what you're doing and kind of focus on the sport, focus on whatever your craft is, and be as good at it as you can possibly be without inviting any extra questions about what's your personal life, what's going on behind closed doors. And I think that seeing any public reaction was something that I wasn't necessarily anticipating. Like I said, when I made that post, it was really just an open appreciation of my partner and, acknowledging everything that we'd been through that I hadn't been able to publicly share. And seeing that it was then this international story where I'm having people reach out to me and telling me how much it meant to them that I came out, like it was so far beyond anything that I ever would have anticipated. Like I said, I was just a rugby player with a dream of being a good rugby player. I was never setting out to do something that nobody else had done before. It just sort of happened that way because I was in this position where I needed to do this for my own happiness, and I knew that it was something that was going to be important to us.
Did you consult anyone, maybe one of your mentors, before making the decision to come out publicly?
I had consulted people like over several years. I mentioned after that 2018 national championship, I had really been considering coming out because I'm like, look, I've already accomplished something I didn't think I was going to accomplish. I'd won the World Maccabea gold medal. I'm like, what is holding me back at this point? And I went to the Bingham Cup in 2018, which for those who don't know, that's basically like the Gay Rugby World Cup. And while I was there, I ran into one of my old mentors from Australia, who was basically a physiotherapist, would do massage therapy, and they were openly gay and had a partner on the team that I played for. And I always kind of felt very comfortable talking to them, but they actually didn't know that I was gay. And I saw them at this Gay World Cup, and it was right after I'd won this championship. It was right, as I'm having this issue with my relationship of not sharing it publicly. And I basically just took them aside and said, I think I want to become the first openly gay professional player in the US. And, I'm like, I was just one of the better players on our national championship team. I think I can get there. If I work hard, I think I can get a contract. And that was when he shared something, about himself that I'd never known, which was that he had actually been a rugby player growing up. So, he was the photographer of our team in Australia and would also help out with physiotherapy. He was just one of the supporters who had a partner on the team. Nobody on the team knew that he had ever played rugby. And the reason for that was when he was in high school, as he was going into his senior season, he was taken aside by the head coach. He was one of the best players in the team, incredibly athletic and fast winger, had been playing on the first team the last year. The coach took him, or the head of rugby took him aside before the season and said, we can't have a, quote unquote, fairy is the nice way of saying the words they used. We can't have a fairy captaining our first 15 team. And this was in the 1970s. And, he said that he was mortified. He had never been out as gay to anybody. He didn't even know, he hadn't even realized himself yet that he was gay. And all of a sudden to be told that, we can't be having you on this team because we can't have a fairy representing our school, it basically made him put down the sport forever. And to the point where he doesn't even feel comfortable sharing the fact that he played with anybody. And when I heard that, the first person that I'm saying out loud this goal to, and him already saying how much it would mean to him as somebody who was driven away from the sport for not being masculine enough, that already just let me know right away that I was on the right path. And he was somebody that I kind of consulted with along the way. But when it came to that day of writing down, that post and hitting send, I didn't tell anybody. I just wanted to surprise Fergus. I'd already made it clear for so long that it was something I wanted to do. I didn't feel like I needed to drag the process out any longer, if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense. And I actually believe in destiny. I think you were meant to have that conversation for your own personal development and for you to understand how monumental this is.
I completely agree. And I don't think that I'd had anyone else in that life, in my life who would have been able to relay that to me. He was somebody that I'd always turned to for advice, was just like such an incredibly wise and lovely person. And to finally see, firsthand that there are people who have been affected by this, right? There are people who have not been able to experience something that's been one of the highlights of my life, which is playing rugby. That really let me know I was on the right path. And like I said, it was coming off of, this experience at the national championship where, I had a conversation with my coach actually after the national championship. And this kind of comes back to what you're saying about destiny, before going to Amsterdam, before having this conversation with, my mentor. He took me aside and was basically complaining about some players from the season, right? Saying, I can't believe that with amateur rugby, I have to deal with so many egos, right? And what he said was, because ultimately when all's said and done, we're all amateur rugby players. We're all drops in the bucket, right? You're going to have your career. You can be proud of it, but nobody else is going to remember it. It's going to be just for you. And when he said that, it really clicked as me because it's true, right? Above and beyond, our sports careers are just going to be for us. It might be something you play a tape for your kid in the future, but it clicked with me. I'm like, that doesn't have to be your story. You have something you can do that would be really impactful and could really make a difference, you don't have to just say that, your career is just going to be for you. You can make this something that's meaningful to more than just yourself. And that was sort of that other thing that set in motion for me that I was really headed on this right path.
For sure. And it is absolutely correct that this is impactful for many more people than you. But I do want to ask you, Devin, now that you've publicly acknowledged your sexual identity, you're living true to yourself, can you express how it's changed your life? I know how it changed mine, and I did come out in the 70s. The only word I could think of was freedom. It just gave me a sense of freedom. How did it impact your life?
It gave me an incredible sense of freedom, but I think more than anything, it gave me an incredible sense of direction. And I think that, when I was in that period before coming out where I was very depressed, right? I'd convinced myself that I'd failed. And, I'd even dealt with at some point my puppy had passed away, a month before I decided to come out very suddenly. I was in this position where I didn't see a very good path forward for myself, right? And I think that people who have dealt with very bad depression can relate to that, where when you're in that mind space, you don't see that thing to look forward to, right? You don't see that thing in your future that makes you excited and motivates you to drive towards that goal. And when all that sort of came crashing down, that's when I was left in this brick wall of, what are things that you can do that would make you happy and that excite you and are challenging to you. And that's how I came across this idea of coming out publicly. And the second that I did that, it became so clear to me all the paths that opened for me, right? All the ways that I could use my life experiences to do something that was meaningful, right? Even if it's going in and doing coaching or going in and speaking to schools and speaking to kids just about my experiences. Because what I realized really quickly is that these kids don't have, somebody they've ever seen who is an openly gay rugby player, who's been successful in the sport, who they respect, who is also willing to just talk openly with them and go and speak to them. And seeing now that there's this path of public speaking and community engagement, as well as me just continuing to play my rugby career, it really reinvigorated me, when I'd been in a point where I really felt like I'd hit that wall, right? Where I'd accomplished things that I didn't think I would accomplish, but then I'd also still failed to accomplish things that were very important to me. It really just gave me this new sense of there is so much out there that you can do. And there's things out there that you can do that you never would have imagined you were going to be able to do.
Do you think one of the reasons you didn't come out sooner was because you wanted to be recognized for your talent as a rugby player and not be known as the token gay player?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that over a 13-year rugby career of not coming out, you probably use about every reason under the sun as to why you're not going to come out and why it doesn't make sense. But that really was a big one for me, especially early on, is, I was captain of my high school team and I went on to become captain of my university team. And throughout that whole time period, I didn't tell, a single one of my teammates really that I was gay. And it was something that I didn't feel comfortable sharing with it. And, I came close to considering it as I was getting to the end of my university career. But what I would tell myself is I'd be like, look, you're captain of this team. You don't want to be seen as a distraction or, as being divisive to the team. But then, as you were saying, something that I really was scaring me was, you're going to come out and be known as that gay player, right? You don't want to be known as that one gay rugby player and not recognized for the fact that you work incredibly hard or that you're a very good leader. And the idea of just being reduced to that, just being, known only as my sexuality, was something that really motivated me to stay in the closet. And also, I think that I just liked the idea of proving people wrong. And I think I'd been told so much throughout my career that, I wouldn't get as far as I got, or I wouldn't, be able to accomplish the things that I did, that I really just internalized things and used it as a way to motivate myself and got comfortable doing that. I think that when you start becoming successful and you find this incredible source of motivation, it becomes very comfortable to just sort of keep it all to yourself, keep doing what you're doing, live kind of a quiet life, but channel that into your rugby abilities. And I think that just over time, I realized that, people are always going to minimize you when you come out and do things like this, right? There's always going to be somebody out there who says that, oh, well, he's, doing this for attention, or, oh, he's not that good of a rugby player. I had been letting my life narrative be ruled for so long by those people, worrying about what those people might say and worried how those people might refer to me. Once that clicked with me, I realized that I didn't have anything that was holding me back anymore, right? I realized that I needed to just go through this because it's something that meant something to me and to my partner. So that was when that really clicked with me that, you're not going to be known as that gay rugby player. And if you are, it's for people that you don't really care to impress anyways, right? So you just have your own self-definition that you're proud of.
Up until recently, most of the professional athletes who've come out as gay did it at the end of their careers when it could no longer affect them professionally. But now we've just recently seen Carl Nassib of the Las Vegas Raiders come out, and he's an active NFL player. Isn't it nice to see finally that things are changing?
It is awesome to see that. I think that it's incredible to see, but I think there's also has to be an understanding with that where, Carl Nassib came out as an active player, but I think that very much in the same sense that I did this is I felt like I'd really accomplished everything and more in my career. And I think that even as a player in the NFL, I guarantee that Carl Nassib had to get to a point in his head where he said, I'm in the NFL. I've already accomplished more than anyone could have reasonably expected of an athlete. I'm going to do this now. So I think there is still this idea where, you have to wait until you've accomplished so much because you don't want to jeopardize anything. He is still, don't get me wrong, he is still, taking an incredible risk and really putting himself out there because he still has many years ahead of him in his career, as you said. But there is still this idea of you need to wait until that moment where you've accomplished more than you thought you would because otherwise you might not get those opportunities. And I think that, Michael Sam experienced that as well, where he sort of waited until he was about to be drafted and then he got drafted or, around that same time after he came out, he was drafted. And I think at that point he had already, accomplished so many things. And unfortunately, he didn't get many opportunities after that. And I think that that's something that he had, weighed in his mind because I know that I weighed that in my mind. I had to go into it and say to myself, if this was the end of your career, assume you lose all these professional opportunities, could you reconcile that? Would you be able to move forward and still be proud of what you did over your rugby career and be proud of the fact that you came out as gay? And to me, the answer was yes. And it just took me a very long time to get to that point and accept that, I would potentially be jeopardizing these opportunities.
But you haven't.
No, I haven't. And I think that's been one of the best surprises is that, if anything, I think it's been a great opportunity for me to, connect with more clubs and open up more possibilities for me to play. For example, I'm looking to play a little bit more in the UK closer to my partner because, at this point, like I said, I've done a lot of things and I'm really happy to keep playing a high level, but I also want to enjoy my life and spend time with my partner. And I think that it's given me that opportunity to kind of travel more and, use my talents in other places and keep doing the sport that I love.
Devin, I want to ask you about the concept of masculinity. For many gay men like me, we were stigmatized and bullied from an early age because we were not masculine enough and we were considered effeminate. And then there's gay guys like you who were the jocks, so people didn't automatically assume you were gay. But once you figured out that you were gay, did you have any difficulty reconciling your sexuality with your concept of masculinity?
I think that I did. I mean, what's interesting, and you say it, it's like, oh, you're the jock, right? They wouldn't assume that you're effeminate or, that you were not masculine enough. But that was one of the things that led me to quitting American football when I tried it was I was bullied for not being masculine enough. I was bullied for not being tough enough. I was assumed to be gay, even though I didn't necessarily have any, mannerisms that would give me off as that. I was just seen as a lesser athlete, and that was automatically, connecting me to being seen as, gay. And I think that it was something that I still really had to deal with was being, not masculine enough, even in these masculine spaces where I'm playing a contact sport and I'm doing it well. I think that for me, I already mentioned before that I really internalized a lot of things, right? And the idea that people thought I wasn't tough enough or thought that I wasn't masculine enough was just a massive fuel to my fire to say, well, then we'll see what happens when we get onto the field. And we'll see what happens in these training setups where I'm going to bring it every single day. And I know that I'm going to bring it every single day. Are you going to do the same? And I think that I always just took those comments that other people had about me or their assumptions that I wasn't athletic enough or, I wasn't tough enough, which honestly, they might not have been wrong. I was not an incredible athlete and I wasn't some, super macho sports player, but I just had an incredible drive to succeed. And I really wanted to always prove people wrong and show that you don't know what my capabilities are. You don't know, how hard I'm willing to push for this to succeed in something. And that really kept me pushing all those years as a player, where I felt like, I might not fit into what their idea of masculinity is going to be, but that doesn't mean that I can't go out there on Saturday and be the toughest player on the field, be the one making the most tackles, and being the one who's just leading by example and showing people that you don't have to be an amazing athlete, or you don't have to be the toughest guy in the room to be the best rugby player.
Well, I want to ask you about that drive to succeed. A lot of successful queer people, including me, learned to channel our anger and our frustration at homophobia into fueling our career ambitions. Did you ever channel your anger and frustration to energize you against your opponents on the rugby field?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'd heard your interview with Greg Louganis as well. And it sounds like I might not be the only, gay athlete who's had this experience of, taking those words that people say and using it as just a way to completely, prove them wrong. But it even kind of went a step beyond that, where a lot of the time where I'm going into a match for a pregame situation, say for the national championship, for an example, I would be in that locker room sitting in there before a game saying, nobody here thinks that you can do this. And that if you were to come out as gay, they would all question that you belonged here. Right. And I would repeat those things to myself and convince myself that the people I was going up against were homophobic. Right. And that they would, basically laugh at the idea that they were playing against a gay player and laugh at my sense of belonging in the sport. And I think that I would just get myself to this space in my head where I convince myself, you don't have to take it easy on these people, right? You don't have to hold back anything. You can go out there and just leave absolutely everything out there. And I think that it was this incredible motivator, right? It was this thing, especially as I was trying to strive to be the first professional openly gay player. It was something that got me out of bed at 5 a.m. to go to training, right? It was something that made sure that I didn't miss a single opportunity to get better or to do the best that I could. But there was also kind of a tremendous pressure that came with that I was putting myself under. And I think that over time, having to get to this very dark place in my mind before going out and doing the sport that I loved, it wasn't always the most conducive thing, right? I think that now that I've come out, I've seen that there is still a place for sort of motivating yourself and proving people wrong. But I think that so many times over those years, I was getting myself to a place of such extreme anger that I wasn't really looking after myself, right? And I wasn't really looking after my own body. I was just going out there and throwing it into people as hard as I could and trying to push myself as hard as I could because I was trying to prove people wrong. And I think now I want to focus more on still proving people wrong and being a successful athlete, but not necessarily doing it from a place of anger, doing it from a place of more of satisfaction of now that I get to be doing this sport that I love and still expressing myself in this way, but it's not coming from anger. It's coming from just this tremendous sense of achievement and love for the sport that I'm doing.
I love that. I have to tell you that my generation of gay people, we had to prove that we were twice as good as everybody else to be considered equal. And I'm hoping that that's not the case anymore.
Yeah, I think that, it's still something that you see though, right? And it's something that, as I know, like you said, it's sort of the history of what we have to go through as gay people, where you do have to be better at your job or you have to be better at what you do because, like you said, you don't want to leave any room for doubt. And that was something that, I had in my mind constantly as a professional, was like, you need to do every single thing you possibly could. You need to be involved in the community efforts. You need to be going to extra trainings and training 7 days a week because you can't give them any reason to exclude you. Right? You can't give them any reason to say that you don't belong in this sport and that, this was an attention grab or anything along those lines. So I think that it's not the same pressure that it used to be, but I think that idea still is really out there, right? You still feel this pressure to make sure that you're the absolute best because you don't want people to be able to say that you don't belong in your craft or that you're not, as good at your job just because you're gay.
Devin, when I was doing my research, I learned that one of your athletic role models is Mark Bingham. I would love you to tell our viewers who he was, what he did, and why he inspired you so much.
So the Bingham Cup I actually mentioned was the basically the Gay Rugby World Cup. That is actually named in his honor and has been going on every year since 2002. So for those who don't know, Mark Bingham was one of the heroes who stopped the hijackers on one of the planes on 9/11 and basically caused it to land in a field rather than to the Capitol, where it was believed that it was beheaded. And he saved, thousands of lives. His actions, along with other passengers on the plane, successfully thwarted the hijackers and saved thousands of people. And, while he was on that flight, he had actually made a call to his mother, and his mother basically told him, what the plans were on 9/11, where the plane was headed, and told him that he had to stop them. And that was their last conversation they ever had. And ever since that moment, his mother carried on his legacy. Mark Bingham was a gay rugby player, and he had played for Cal, which is one of the best rugby programs in the country. He'd gone on to play for the San Francisco Fog, which is one of the most, well-known inclusive gay rugby teams in the world. And it was one of the first. And he basically was, somebody who was never afraid to connect his sexuality with his rugby career. And his mom, took forward this pride that he had as a gay rugby player and used it to create this incredible legacy, which is the Bingham Cup, where now all inclusive gay rugby teams from all over the world, come and celebrate not only his life and legacy, but now celebrate that rugby is a place where, there are spaces for gay players, and that, it is a world where now we can be gay rugby players and be celebrated for it. And, Alice, who's Mark Bingham's mother, became, a second mom to, thousands of rugby players across the world who had never had that, loving mother figure. She was, an ally in every sense of the word. She really took on, all these extra children. And unfortunately, she recently passed away this past year, and, is just so irreplaceable. I mean, I actually met her in that same tournament where right before I had that conversation with my mentor, I had just spoken to Alice, and I just told her how much Mark's story had meant to me, and how much, seeing all these people coming from all over the world to honor somebody for, being a rugby player and being a hero like he was, and appreciating him being gay, and how that inspired them, really showed me that there was this incredible value and power in what I wanted to do, and that I would be able to impact people in that way. So I always had this very personal connection to Mark and his story and to his family. And, they really just gave me another motivation to, carry it forward and try to do something that hopefully she and, he would be proud of looking back.
Do you really get deep down inside that you are inspiring and motivating people in the same way that he motivated you?
I think I hope that I'm doing that. I always kind of question. I think that, especially when I came out, you always feel this idea that, maybe you're not doing enough, right? And like, maybe feeling like you always need to do more and need to try to inspire as many people as you possibly can. But the idea that I have, and from the few people who I've had those personal interactions with, who they've told me how I've impacted them, it's just like so incredibly meaningful to me, because like I said, rugby was just a passion that I had, and just something that I poured myself into, never thinking how, coming out would really necessarily impact or help other people. It only was when I started to make that decision that I realized how important it could be. And the idea that I can now, impact people in that way, just from talking about, something I loved so much, which was my rugby career, and, kind of the journey that I had along the way. Like, I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to motivate or inspire anybody in that way, because I think that, rugby is just such an incredible sport. But I think that it's great to hopefully inspire other people to say that, you can go outside of what other people would ever expect of you. And you shouldn't put those boundaries on yourself based on what other people's expectations are.
We still hear a lot about the locker room mentality and the culture in the sports world. There's a lot of homophobia there. Do you think that's ever going to change?
I hope so. I really do hope so. And I think that it is changing. It has already improved significantly, but the issue also is it really depends where you are in the world, right? I mean, we still have countries where it's illegal to be gay. So I think that in those countries, it's going to take a significantly longer time to get to that point than it's going to take somewhere, like Canada or the United States, where, most states and provinces have, protections for LGBTQ plus people. But I think that we are starting to make real progress, because I think we're starting to dive into the understanding of, the impact that your words can have, right? And how much what you say does matter. And especially, and this is something I really try to explain to people, is when you're a closeted athlete, you're looking for any reason to assume somebody's not going to be supportive, right? You're looking around, and if somebody uses, gay as a way to belittle somebody, you're going to use that as a way to say, okay, well, now I know that that's somebody who wouldn't be supportive of me if I came out, right? Or somebody who would, even if they wouldn't say it to my face, would think lesser of me because that clearly is how they feel about gay people. And I think that when you allow those kinds of words to be used in a sports environment, that's the message you're sending to people in the closet. You're sending the message that your fears are correct and that you will be viewed differently when you come out. And I think that now that teams are starting to understand that more, and organizations are really working with, professional clubs and grassroots coaches to make sure they know how to make their, spaces more inclusive and focusing on what language they allow and what they don't allow. I think that that is how we're going to get to that point where hopefully we get that out of the sport. But ultimately, there's always going to be those bad apples. I think what it comes down to is making sure that at least the structure and the organization is there to say that even with those bad apples, that's not something that we will stand for.
I hope you're right. Now, you've been very active as a rugby coach. Are you the kind of coach that you wish you'd had as a young player?
I think that I am. Yeah. I mean, I always really thrived off of having like positive motivation. I think that so many times over the years, I convinced myself that I needed negative motivation to thrive. But then when I looked back on the coaches who impacted me the most, it were the ones who, were hard on me and gave me critiques, but were incredibly positive. And, the coaches who would see the potential that I saw for myself. I think that I really struggled to find coaches who would look at me and say that I had the potential that I thought I had. And I think that, the few times where I had a coach who saw like there was something special and that there was something that I could really do that was powerful as a player, that's what motivated me. And I think now that I'm in a position to coach, I really just focus on, letting the kids learn the game and learn to love it. I think that the coaches that I loved the most were ones that made it clear that the sport was for everybody. They weren't going to have anybody feeling othered in our teams, and just to make sure that rugby was fun. And that's what it should be, is that it's a game that you have fun and you connect with other people and you make these relationships that last a lifetime. And, when I approach my coaching, that's what I want to do, is I want to just make sure that the kids love it, but that they also know that they're always welcome there, and that it's a space where everybody is going to be welcome and celebrated just for being themselves and for loving the game that I love.
Devin, there's a very well-known quote by Winston Churchill. You've probably heard it a million times, but I'd love to get your reaction. He said that soccer is a gentleman's game played by hooligans, and rugby is a hooligan's game played by gentlemen. Do you agree?
I think that in theory that is correct in this, but I do always have a little bit of difficulty with this quote. And one of the reasons I'll say that is I always felt like there was a bit of a racial connotation to that quote, because rugby, especially in the United Kingdom, was always a very upper class and very predominantly white sport, right? Rugby union was generally played by the boarding schools and, the schools and programs that had a lot of money. And soccer was a game that was more of a common man's game, right? Anybody who had a ball, they could all play it. And I think that a lot of people felt like when Churchill said that quote, he was referring the hooligans who were playing soccer as people who were not white and not affluent, and the gentlemen were the people who are in, high society and in these boarding schools where they're, very put together and, professional off of the field, and, what they would want them to see in terms of being, young white men who are playing this sport, that they were seen as gentlemen. So I think that that is the part of that quote that gets me a little bit like uncomfortable, because I do feel like there is that sort of connotation. But I think what he was really trying to get at was this sort of mentalities in the game where in football, you can yell at the referee and you can, do all these things which would be completely unacceptable in rugby. Rugby has this really big ethos of respecting the referees and respecting your teammates and respecting your opponents. So if I'm giving him benefit of the doubt, that's what I'll say he was alluding to more. But there is always that aspect that I've been a little bit like, I don't know if that's what he was getting at with this quote, but I'm going to try to take it that way.
Me too. You're the global ambassador for International Gay Rugby. What are some of the goals that you hope to achieve in that role?
I think that, like I said, I really just want to get out there and be visible in schools, right? And have the opportunity to talk to people about my experiences and encourage them that, rugby is a sport that they can do, and that there's not a sport that they shouldn't be able to do just because of, what their sexuality is or what their experiences are. So I really just want to be, somebody who's an incredible role model, hopefully, and somebody who they can look to and say that, this is somebody who has accomplished something in this sport and is happy, right? It came out as openly gay and was supported by the community, and this is somewhere where we could be supported as well. And I think that with International Gay Rugby, with all these inclusive gay rugby teams, it's great that we have these teams where there's a space where you can go in and be surrounded by people who are supportive of you or have had similar experiences. But I also want them to know that, the entire sport is a place for them. There's not just specific teams they have to play for it. They can play for anybody. And, as long as they pursue it, they're going to have those opportunities. And, I think just to get people to see that they're capable of more than they ever would think they are.
Well, one of the reasons I admire you so much is because of your advocacy on behalf of trans women being allowed to play women's rugby at the international competitive level. This is probably the most contentious issue that World Rugby has ever faced, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that, when they made this decision, it was very much done kind of behind closed doors. And there were a lot of things about this decision that didn't sit right with me and other members of the rugby community. I mentioned this idea that rugby is seen as a sport for everybody, right? Rugby is inclusive for all, and, that there's a space for every body type and every type of person and every level of athlete in rugby. So to see that World Rugby would turn around and say, well, not this type of athlete, right? We don't want trans women playing in our sport, was really harmful. I mean, like, to see now that we're going to start drawing the line of who can and cannot be allowed to compete in our sport. And the way that they did it, they did it very much behind closed doors. They didn't really listen to these experiences or invite in trans people to share their experiences in the game. And, they invited in groups such as Fair Play for Women, which has a very long history of advocating against the inclusion of trans women in women's only spaces, such as, shelters and prisons, and, very publicly holds the idea that, trans women aren't women, they're biological males, quote unquote. So to have somebody like that in this decision-making process while making a decision that's going to affect the livelihood and, the safety, if we're being honest, of trans women by, depriving them of a space where they once felt, incredibly included and felt loved, is just something that goes completely against the values of our sport. And I would hope that people would agree also the values of our society. But for me, especially as rugby, if we're going to preach this idea that it's for everybody, we need to hold true to that and make sure that we are understanding that trans people are a part of that, right? And that trans people are a part of our rugby community. And, that is not something that we should be changing or looking to change.
I found it interesting that you used the word safety because I think the argument that's always been raised against allowing trans women to play rugby is safety and legal liability. But that's really a non-issue, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at the science that they use to justify their studies, one of the main studies that they used as a kind of supplement to justifying that there was a safety issue was actually a car crash simulation model, a computer model, where they basically took the weight of average biological men against the average weight of what they said biological women. So in this case, cis men versus cis women, they took their average kind of masses and ran it through this car crash simulation and used that to justify that there was an increased risk of head trauma, right? And that was all they had. They didn't have any actual studies of trans women playing against women. All they were using was data of men against women and using that to try to infer that that is the same as trans women playing against women. So I think that when you look at that and see that there is no real justification for these safety issues, there's no, women's players are not calling out and saying how awful, this idea of trans participation in their sport is and how it's harming opportunities. There's never been a trans woman, to play in the Olympics up until this year. We are now hopefully about to see our first trans woman competing in the Olympics. So the idea that they're dominant in rugby when they haven't, participated in Rugby World Cups either is just kind of absurd to me. And to have this ban that is affecting the top level, for those who don't know, this ban only affects international competition. So you're now saying that the best athletes in the world, the best women in the world, the ones who have been training their entire lives aren't good enough to play against trans women and can't do it safely. I think it's it's just very asinine to me. Like when you can't provide any documentation of instances where, women have been put in danger by trans women. And there was even this massive campaign among women's rugby when trans women were banned, where they listed off, instances where they felt unsafe in rugby, right? They said, for example, I felt unsafe when I showed up to a match and the field is, covered in glass, or there's an unsafe field condition. And, I feel unsafe when we don't, take the time to do full background checks of all the coaches involved in women's rugby, all these issues they've faced over the years of women rugby. And they say, not one of those instances was when I had to play with or against a trans woman, right? That is not a safety issue that's impacting their sport. So when it's not an issue brought forth by the players, and it's not an issue that is being supported by science, you really have to kind of take a step back and say, well, what is the issue here? And unfortunately, what it comes down to is transphobia, right? And just a lack of understanding of, trans women and the sort of transformation that they go through after they go through their transitions.
Well, I think it's important to note that USA Rugby and Rugby Canada have rejected World Rugby's decision, so that is a step in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to see that and see that there have been other world unions who are willing to say that, this is not something that we agree with is going to go a long way. But then I think this is also something that reflects very poorly on World Rugby, because they said for a long time during this kind of judicial process that they were going to come forward and bring it to a vote for the member nations. They were going to have different rugby unions across the world vote on this policy and see if it would be upheld or not. And they decided to go back on that and just unilaterally pass it without bringing it to any of the world unions. So to see that they're now still standing up and saying, we don't agree with this is awesome. But I think that World Rugby also needs to realize how bad this is, where some of the top rugby unions in the world are looking at your studies and looking at your data and saying this is not a sufficient reason to exclude an entire population of people.
But that being said, would you agree with me that rugby is probably one of the most inclusive sports when it comes to sexuality, gender, and racial diversity? I mean, you tried American football, you found it to be homophobic, and you were bullied.
Yeah, I think that compared to football, it might be better, but I think it's one of those things where if we're going to start patting ourselves on the back for being inclusive compared to other sports when we're still dealing with all these issues, and like I said, there is still this incredible history in rugby where a lot of the time it was known as being, a very white sport, right? And I say incredible history in the sense that it's a very old sport and it's a very storied sport, but it's been a predominantly white sport. It was a sport that was brought to a lot of countries such as South Africa and Australia, due to due to colonization. And this is also a history that we have to deal with in our sport as well. And there is also this history now in men's rugby where, I'm one of only a handful of players worldwide who has played professionally and felt like they could come out. So if we're comfortable saying that, we're the most inclusive sport because of these things and pat ourselves on the back, then, that's okay. But I think that a lot of it is really feeling the need to make sure that we're going above and beyond to be the most inclusive sport, right? Not just saying we've already made it and there's no work to be done. I think that there are so many amazing aspects. I think especially women's rugby in terms of LGBTQ plus is incredibly inclusive, and trans women across the board have echoed that was a space where they felt welcomed in sport like no other spaces. But then when you go to the other side of the coin of men's rugby and asking men's players, how included they felt as being a gay player in a training environment, that might not be the same, right? And I think that as you go across different countries, there are also issues with that as well. So I will say that yes, rugby in comparison to other sports has an incredible potential to be inclusive and is inclusive in a lot of instances. But I always get a very uncomfortable feeling when I come out and praise rugby for being incredibly inclusive when I've also seen, a lot of instances where people would not feel very included.
So, Devin, what do you have to say to queer people out there who are struggling with whether or not to come out?
I think the biggest thing I would say is take your time. I think that, I put myself under a lot of pressure trying to give myself timelines of when I had to come out and trying to align that with a certain achievement or a certain event in my life. I would just say really take the time to, know yourself, become comfortable with who you are, and taking the time to make those, incredible connections and friendships around you, where you know that when you do come out, you're going to have that kind of support, and know that you'll never have to worry about, if those people will have your backs. I think that there's so much pressure almost put on people to come out, and saying that, this is something you need to do, and you need to do it, as early as possible. But everyone's on their own journey, right? Somebody might feel comfortable coming out to everybody after, a year or two of, feeling a certain way, and other people might need more time than that. And that's okay. And it really depends on your circumstances and, the consequences you might face for coming out. So I really just encourage people to take it at their own pace.
So take your time, do it when you're ready, and build a support system. That's good
Yeah.
advice.
I try to give us. It's hard with the general advice, right? I need more background, but I think that is something I can safely say would really benefit everyone.
Do you think you'll ever write a book?
I think I would definitely be interested in doing that. I feel like there's so much that I haven't been able to discuss just around my rugby career, and between playing rugby in Australia and New Zealand and England, and all the kind of incredible experiences I've had traveling the world and with my friends, like I had a friend who I lived with in New Zealand and Australia, and all the times that we've had together over the years, and my experiences of being kind of a closeted gay athlete in a scenario where everyone is very much the opposite of that, and just being very heteronormative. I think that there are a lot of very interesting things I could touch on, and I wouldn't rule it out. I think it's only been 6 months or 7 months since I came out, so I haven't quite gotten started on the book tour just yet, but it's something I would be very interested in on the horizon.
Well, the reason I asked you that is because I can easily see your story being the subject of a movie.
That would also be incredible. I think that, yeah, I think that, with all the things that I've been through, I think that there's just a lot to work off of in terms of, my injuries, and, having to, hide my relationships when I was overseas. When I was in New Zealand, I was living, like I mentioned, with my friend, and I was out to him, but the woman who owned the house, I wasn't out to. And so there's very much of those scenarios of, sneaking people in, and, trying to hide things, but also probably not hiding things very well. And I think a lot of it was almost, like, looking back, kind of comical, and in a lot of ways was a struggle at the same time. And so I think that there were a lot of ups and downs over the years that I would really like to see hashed out in that way.
Trust me, I think a lot of gay people can relate to what you're saying. So what's next for Devin Ibañez? Where do you see yourself in 5 years?
In 5 years, I really want to just be traveling the world and, playing rugby, but also doing public speaking. Like I said, going in and speaking to schools, speaking to teams, organizations, and sharing my experiences, but also sharing ways to make their organizations or sports more inclusive, and making it a space where everybody feels more comfortable, not just if you're gay, right? Not just if you're a member of the LGBTQ plus community, but everybody, right? And I think that that's something that gets missed a lot when we talk about inclusivity, as we talk about gearing it towards one or two specific groups. We don't talk about it as a holistic thing, right? And making it something that everybody is going to feel welcome. So I really want to just get to the point where I can meet as many people as I can, share my story with as many people as I can, and keep doing what I love, which is rugby, and I think that that is such an incredible gift, that that's an opportunity that I'll be able to have, of just going around and sharing what I've been through, but also being completely immersed in a sport that I really, truly love.
Well, Devin, it's been truly an honor to have you on our show. I know something about what it's like to be the first to come out in one's chosen field, and my generation sacrificed a lot so that your generation would have it easier than we did. So thank you for your courage, for your commitment to inclusivity and equality, and thank you so much for coming on our show.
Oh, no, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, thank you so much for paving the way. Like you said, you went through so much to come out at the time that you did. And it means so much to me now, as somebody who's come out and been received in the way that I have, to look and, see all the work that you did that made this possible, of me not being, overcome with death threats and not having to deal with all this incredible negativity. The fact that I was able to come out and be received with such positivity is an incredible privilege. And I'm so grateful for it. And I want to thank you for everything that you've done as well.
So please remember, Devin, when you're thinking about the impact you've had on young people, please remember that my generation is also impacted, because we take pride in what you've done. And we are very grateful that whatever we did might have made it a little easier for you to tell your parents when you were 11 that you were gay, and to be true to yourself. So thank you for all of that.
Oh, Thank you so much. And it is definitely something that I will keep in mind and is always going to be kind of motivating me is, knowing, like you said, that path that you have set for me, that hopefully we can now keep widening that path even more and making it accessible to even more people to have these kinds of experiences.
Thank you. Our guest has been rugby hero and LGBTQ plus activist, Devin Ibañez. My name is Harvey Brownstone. Thank you to our producer, Steve Silver. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Remember to subscribe to the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. And be sure to check out more great interviews with Harvey Brownstone on harveybrownstoneinterviews.com.